A homeless black man stands before a judge while a police officer smirks and whispers jokes about his appearance. But when the man's military records are read aloud, that smirk quickly disappears. What the officer discovers next will leave you speechless. The courtroom's reaction? Absolutely unforgettable. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. Officer Daniels couldn't help but smirk as he watched the disheveled man being led into the courtroom. Another day, another vagrant clogging up the system. The man's tattered army jacket hung loosely from his thin frame, his beard matted and unkempt. The stale smell of someone who hadn't showered in weeks wafted through the air as he shuffled past, his eyes fixed on the floor. Daniels nudged his partner, Officer Reynolds, with an elbow and stifled a laugh. This would be quick. Docket ending 4479, Commonwealth versus James Marshall, trespassing and disturbing the peace, the clerk announced. Daniels had arrested Marshall 3 days ago, finding him asleep in the doorway of the Westfield Bank downtown. The bank manager had called it in, complaining about the unsightly homeless person scaring away customers. When Daniels arrived, Marshall had refused to move, claiming he was just trying to stay out of the rain. His stubborn attitude had irritated Daniels, who didn't appreciate backtalk from street people. The arrest had been rougher than necessary, if Daniels was honest with himself. Judge Sandra Coleman peered over her glasses at the defendant. Her reputation for efficiency meant these nuisance cases rarely took more than 5 minutes of the court's time. "Mr. Marshall, how do you plead?" she asked, her tone already carrying the weariness of a long docket. Marshall looked up, his eyes surprisingly clear and focused despite his appearance. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Daniels rolled his eyes. They always pleaded not guilty, even when caught red-handed. It just dragged things out. "Your Honor," Marshall continued, his voice stronger than expected, "I was seeking shelter from the storm. I'm a veteran, and I've been trying to access services at the VA, but..." The defendant was clearly trespassing on private property after being warned multiple times to vacate the area. Daniels interrupted, stepping forward. "This is his 3rd citation this month." The judge glanced at Daniels with mild annoyance at the interruption. "Officer, I'll hear the prosecution when it's time." Daniels nodded and stepped back, but not before sharing another smirk with Reynolds. The "I'm a veteran" excuse was common among the homeless population. Whether true or not, it rarely made a difference in these proceedings. "Mr. Marshall," Judge Coleman continued, "while I sympathize with your situation, the law is clear regarding trespassing on private property. The court can't allow..." "Your Honor," a voice called from the back of the courtroom. "May I approach?" All heads turned to see a tall man in a crisp blue suit walking confidently down the center aisle. Daniels recognized him immediately. Captain David Rodriguez, a decorated Marine officer who now worked as a veterans advocate in the city. What was he doing here? "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Coleman acknowledged with surprise. "This is unusual. Are you representing Mr. Marshall?" "I am, Your Honor," Rodriguez replied, placing his briefcase on the defense table. "Just this morning, in fact, and I have information that's directly relevant to these proceedings." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. Rodriguez was well respected in the community and had connections throughout the local government. This simple case had suddenly become complicated. "Your Honor," Rodriguez continued, "Mr. Marshall is not only a veteran but a highly decorated one. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan as part of a special operations unit. He was awarded the Silver Star for Valor after saving his entire squad during an ambush." Judge Coleman's eyebrows rose. "Is this documented, Captain?" "It is," Rodriguez replied, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "I have his service record here, along with documentation of his medical condition." Mr. Marshall suffers from severe PTSD and a traumatic brain injury sustained during combat. He's been on the waiting list for VA housing for over 8 months. Daniels felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest as Rodriguez handed the documents to the court clerk, who then passed them to the judge. He remembered how he'd laughed when Marshall had mentioned being a soldier, how he'd roughly cuffed the man's hands behind his back despite his wincing. Furthermore, Rodriguez added, the night Officer Daniels arrested him, Mr. Marshall had just been turned away from the overflow shelter due to capacity issues. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees with heavy rain. He wasn't trespassing for criminal purposes. He was simply trying not to freeze. Judge Coleman reviewed the documents, her expression growing increasingly troubled. These records indicate Mr. Marshall received not only a Silver Star, but also 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Daniels could feel eyes turning toward him, including those of his partner. The smirk that had been on his face moments ago had vanished. Marshall stood straighter now, as if Rodriguez's presence had restored something in him. Despite his ragged appearance, a dignity emerged that Daniels hadn't noticed before. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, "while the defendant's service is commendable, the law regarding trespassing remains clear." Judge Coleman held up her hand. "I'm well aware of the law, Counselor. I'm also aware of the city's obligations to its veterans." She turned her attention to Marshall. "Mr. Marshall, this court thanks you for your service and sacrifices for our country." Marshall nodded slightly, his eyes now fixed on the judge rather than the floor. "In light of the circumstances and your documented medical conditions, I'm dismissing the charges," Judge Coleman declared. "Furthermore, I'm ordering immediate coordination with the VA to expedite your housing application." Rodriguez smiled. "Thank you, Your Honor. I've already begun that process." Daniels stood frozen, the weight of his misjudgment settling heavily on his shoulders. He'd mocked this man, roughed him up during arrest, and laughed about his claims that turned out to be entirely true. Judge Coleman wasn't finished. "Officer Daniels," she called out, causing him to snap to attention. "Please approach the bench." Daniels moved forward on legs that suddenly felt wooden, aware of every eye in the courtroom following him. "Officer," she said, her voice low but stern, "your conduct in this arrest will be reviewed. Captain Rodriguez has indicated that excessive force may have been used, and given Mr. Marshall's medical conditions, that's particularly troubling." "Your Honor, I was following protocol for a resistant subject," Daniels began, but his voice lacked conviction. "Was he actually resistant, officer, or just unable to comply quickly due to his injuries?" The judge's gaze was unwavering. "I'm referring this matter to internal affairs. You're dismissed." As Daniels turned to leave, he found himself face to face with Marshall. Up close, he could now see the faded scars partially hidden by the man's beard, the slight tremor in his left hand, details he'd overlooked in his rush to judgment. Marshall didn't speak, but his eyes conveyed what words couldn't: disappointment, hurt, and a dignity that transcended his current circumstances. In that moment, Daniels saw not a homeless vagrant, but a warrior who had given everything for his country, only to be discarded and forgotten. Rodriguez placed a hand on Marshall's shoulder. "Let's get you somewhere safe, James. We've got a lot of work to do." As they walked away, Daniels remained rooted to the spot, the laughter he'd shared with his partner earlier now a distant, shameful memory. In its place was an uncomfortable question that would haunt him long after the courtroom emptied. How many other James Marshalls had he misjudged? The precinct hallway seemed longer than usual as Officer Michael Daniels made his way to Captain Rivera's office. 3 days had passed since the courtroom incident. 3 days of sidelong glances from fellow officers and whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the break room. The story had spread quickly. Daniels, The cop who'd laughed at a decorated war hero, the officer who'd manhandled a Silver Star recipient. Even his partner Reynolds had distanced himself, requesting a temporary reassignment that had been granted with suspicious speed. "Enter." Captain Rivera's voice responded to his knock. Daniels stepped inside, his uniform pressed perfectly, shoes shined to a mirror finish, small defenses against what he knew was coming. "Sit down, Daniels," Rivera said, not looking up from the folder open on his desk. The captain was a 20-year veteran with a perpetual scowl and a reputation for fairness that made officers respect him even when they feared his judgment. Daniels sat stiffly, watching as Rivera methodically signed several forms before finally closing the folder and looking up. "Internal Affairs has completed their preliminary review," Rivera said without preamble. "They've recommended a 30-day suspension without pay, pending completion of sensitivity training and a full psychological evaluation." Daniels had expected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. "Yes, sir," he managed. "I added a note to their recommendation," Rivera continued, his gaze unwavering. "I suggested that upon your return, you be temporarily assigned to community outreach at the Veterans Resource Center." Daniels blinked in surprise. "The VRC? Captain, I don't think—" "That's precisely the problem, Daniels. You didn't think." Rivera leaned forward. "James Marshall isn't just any veteran. He's a legend in certain circles. Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart. His unit calls him the Ghost because he once stayed behind enemy lines for 9 days to rescue a captured teammate, surviving on nothing but rainwater and sheer determination." Daniels felt the weight of his ignorance grow heavier with each word. "The man you laughed at," Rivera continued, "once carried a wounded soldier 12 miles through mountain terrain while bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds himself." "I didn't know," Daniels said quietly. "That's not good enough." Rivera's fist came down hard on the desk. "You didn't need to know his service record to treat him with basic human dignity. Badge or no badge, that's a fundamental failure." The words stung because they echoed Daniels' own thoughts during his sleepless nights since the courtroom. He had replayed the arrest in his mind countless times. Marshall's quiet insistence that he just needed shelter from the rain, the way he had winced when Daniels wrenched his arms back, the flicker of resignation in his eyes, as if this treatment was nothing new. "Captain Rodriguez has been calling every hour demanding updates," Rivera said, his voice calmer now. "The only reason this hasn't hit the media is because Marshall doesn't want the attention." That surprised Daniels. "He's protecting me?" "No," Rivera said bluntly. "He's protecting his own privacy. The last thing a man with severe PTSD needs is cameras in his face and reporters dredging up his war experiences." Daniels nodded, a new shame washing over him. Even now, he'd assumed Marshall's actions were about him. "Your suspension begins tomorrow," Rivera said, sliding a form across the desk. "Sign here. And Daniels, use this time wisely. When you come back, I need to see an officer who remembers why he put on the badge in the first place." Daniels signed the form, his signature an unsteady scrawl that seemed fitting for his current state of mind. "Yes, sir." Outside the precinct, Daniels stood in the bright afternoon sunlight, the weight of his suspension notice heavy in his pocket. 30 days without pay would strain his finances, but that concern seemed trivial compared to the knot of guilt and confusion tangled in his chest. He found himself walking without clear direction, his mind replaying not just the Marshall incident but other arrests, other encounters with the homeless population that frequented downtown. How many had he dismissed with the same casual contempt? How many had stories he'd never bothered to learn? His wandering brought him to Veterans Memorial Park, a small green space dedicated to those who had served. He sat heavily on a bench, watching an old man carefully arranging flags beside the central monument. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, son," the man said, glancing over at Daniels. Daniels recognized him as Henry Watkins, a Vietnam veteran who volunteered as the park's unofficial caretaker. "Just a bad day at work, Henry," he replied. Henry nodded sagely. "Must be more than that to bring a busy officer to sit and brood in the middle of his shift." Daniels looked down at his uniform, suddenly aware that he was indeed supposed to be on patrol. His last shift before the suspension. "I messed up," he admitted. "Mistreated someone I shouldn't have." "Ah," Henry said, placing the last flag and joining Daniels on the bench. "We all do that from time to time. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" It was the simplicity of the question that caught Daniels off guard. What was he going to do? Accept the suspension as a bureaucratic punishment, go through the motions of sensitivity training, and return to the force unchanged? Or use this moment as something more meaningful? "I don't know," he answered honestly. Henry studied him for a moment. "You know, during my time in Vietnam, I learned that most men fall into 3 categories when they make a big mistake. There's those who deny it happened, those who acknowledge it but blame circumstances, and those who own it completely and work to make it right." He stood up with a slight grimace, his aged joints protesting. Only one of those paths leads to being able to look yourself in the mirror again. With that, Henry returned to his work, leaving Daniels alone with his thoughts. The old veteran's words resonated uncomfortably, forcing him to examine which category he fell into. So far, he realized, he'd been firmly in the second group, acknowledging the mistake but viewing it through the lens of ignorance rather than taking full responsibility. His phone buzzed with a text from Reynolds. "IA wants my statement tomorrow. Sorry, man." Daniels didn't reply. He couldn't blame his partner for distancing himself. Reynolds had a family to support and a promising career ahead. Besides, he wasn't wrong to cooperate with the investigation. As the afternoon stretched on, Daniels found himself searching online for information about James Marshall. There wasn't much. Military records were typically private, but he found a 5-year-old newspaper article about a special operations unit returning from Afghanistan. In a grainy group photo, he spotted a younger Marshall, standing tall and proud in his uniform, his eyes clear and focused, a hint of a smile on his face. Nothing like the haunted gaze Daniels had seen in the courtroom. What had happened in the years between? How did a decorated soldier end up sleeping in bank doorways? The questions nagged at him, not just out of curiosity but from a growing need to understand the man he had wronged. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Daniels made a decision. He wouldn't just serve his suspension, he would use it. Captain Rivera wanted him to work at the Veterans Resource Center upon his return, but why wait? He could volunteer there during his suspension, learn about the challenges veterans faced, try to understand what had happened to men like Marshall. It wouldn't undo his mistake. Nothing could erase the moment he'd laughed at a hero's suffering. But perhaps it could be the first step toward becoming the kind of officer who wouldn't make that mistake again. With newfound resolve, Daniels stood and walked out of the park. Tomorrow would be the first day of his suspension, but also the first day of something else. A journey toward redemption that would challenge everything he thought he knew about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of respect. The Veterans Resource Center occupied a modest brick building on the edge of downtown, its faded sign and small parking lot belying the vital services provided within. Daniels sat in his car for 15 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, before finding the courage to go inside. He'd called yesterday and spoken with the volunteer coordinator, a woman named Lisa who had sounded skeptical, but agreed to meet with him. "You're the officer from the Marshall case," she said when he entered her cluttered office. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Daniels admitted, resisting the urge to look away from her appraising gaze. Lisa Chen was perhaps 50, with streaks of gray in her black hair and the efficient movements of someone perpetually short on time. "And you want to volunteer here during your suspension? Why?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. He'd prepared a speech about wanting to give back to the community, about learning more about veterans' issues. But under Lisa's scrutiny, those practiced words felt hollow. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "Not just about Marshall, but about how I've been approaching my job. I need to understand what I've been missing." Lisa studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "We need help sorting donations, answering phones, and general office work. Nothing public-facing until I'm convinced you won't do more harm than good. Starting now." And so began Daniel's education. For 3 days, he sorted through mountains of donated clothing, separating what was actually useful from what people had simply cleaned out of their closets. He answered phones, directing veterans to appropriate services, and taking messages for the overworked staff. He filed paperwork, made coffee, and stayed out of the way of the professionals who provided medical, legal, and psychological support to the steady stream of veterans who came through the doors. Through it all, he listened and observed. He learned about wait times for VA appointments that stretched into months, about the labyrinthine paperwork required to access benefits, about veterans who had given everything for their country only to return to a system that seemed designed to frustrate rather than support them. On his 4th day, Lisa assigned him to the front desk during the lunch hour. "Just direct people to the right offices," she instructed. "Try not to screw it up." Daniels took the assignment as a small sign of trust. He sat at the desk, reviewing the directory of services, when the front door opened. His heart stuttered as James Marshall walked in, looking markedly different than he had in court. The beard was trimmed, the hair cut short in military fashion. He wore clean jeans and a button-up shirt that, while not new, had clearly been pressed. Marshall stopped short when he saw Daniels, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice controlled. "Mr. Marshall," Daniels replied, his mouth suddenly dry. "I'm not here as an officer. I'm volunteering." Marshall's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. "You're here to see Captain Rodriguez?" Daniels asked, fighting to maintain his professional composure. "He set up a meeting with a housing coordinator," Marshall confirmed, still keeping his distance from the desk. Daniels checked the schedule. "That would be Ms. Patel in room 204. 2nd floor, 1st door on your right." Marshall nodded and moved toward the stairs, but paused at the bottom step. "Why are you here?" he asked, turning back. The question was the same as Lisa's, but carried a different weight coming from this man. Daniels owed him the truth. "To learn," he said. "To understand what I failed to see before. I'm suspended for 30 days, and I'm spending it here." Marshall considered this. "Voluntarily?" "Yes." A long moment passed between them, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Marshall nodded again. "Good," he said simply, and continued up the stairs. When Lisa returned from lunch, Daniels told her about the encounter. "He didn't tell me to go to hell," he said, still somewhat surprised by that fact. "I would have, in his position." "James isn't the type," Lisa replied, shuffling through the mail. "He's seen too much to waste energy on grudges, but don't mistake that for forgiveness." "I wouldn't," Daniels assured her. "Has he been coming here long?" Lisa gave him a measuring look, apparently deciding whether to share the information. "About 6 months," she finally said. "Captain Rodriguez found him sleeping under the Highway 9 overpass and literally carried him in here when he was too weak to walk. Malnutrition, pneumonia, infected wounds that never healed properly after his last tour. It took weeks just to stabilize him physically." Daniels absorbed this, picturing the strong soldier from the newspaper photo reduced to such a state. How does someone like him end up homeless? Doesn't the military take care of its own? The bitter laugh that escaped Lisa told him immediately how naive the question was. You have a lot to learn, Officer Daniels. The military spends millions training soldiers for war, but pennies preparing them for peace. James came home with severe PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and a body full of shrapnel. The VA prescribed medications he couldn't afford, therapy appointments he couldn't get to because he didn't have transportation, and housing assistance with a 2-year waiting list. She leaned forward, her voice intensifying. Do you know what triggered his final spiral? His service dog died. The one thing keeping him anchored through the nightmares and flashbacks, and he couldn't afford the vet bills to save him. Within months, he lost his apartment, his job, and nearly his life. The revelation hit Daniels like a physical blow. A man who had risked everything for his country, reduced to such vulnerability by the loss of a companion animal. The injustice of it was staggering. That's why Captain Rodriguez is so protective of him, Lisa continued. James is brilliant, special forces typically are, but his brain injury affects his executive functioning. He gets overwhelmed easily by paperwork and bureaucracy. Without an advocate, he'd still be on the streets. Daniels thought about the countless homeless veterans he'd encountered on patrol, how many he'd shooed away from businesses or public parks without ever considering the conditions that had put them there. What can I do? He asked, the question emerging from somewhere deep and unfamiliar within him. Lisa's expression softened slightly. Keep doing what you're doing. Learn. Listen. And when you go back to being a cop, remember what you've learned here. The afternoon passed slowly, with Daniels processing what he'd discovered. Around 4 o'clock, Marshall came back downstairs, speaking quietly with a woman Daniels recognized as the housing coordinator. There was a cautious optimism in Marshall's expression that hadn't been there before. As he headed for the exit, he paused at the front desk where Daniels was organizing intake forms. Officer, he said quietly, can I ask you something? Of course, Daniels replied, caught off guard by the initiation. That night, at the bank, Marshall hesitated. Would it have made a difference if I'd told you more about my service? If I'd shown you my medals? The question stripped away Daniels' defenses, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth. It shouldn't have mattered, he said finally. Whether you were a war hero or not, I should have treated you with dignity. But yes, I probably would have acted differently. And that's the problem. Marshall studied him, seeming to assess the honesty of the response. Then he nodded slowly. I left my medals at a pawn shop in Columbus 2 years ago, he said. Needed money for antibiotics. Funny thing is, when I handed them over, the shop owner cried. I didn't. They didn't mean anything to me by then. He turned to leave, but Daniels called after him. Mr. Marshall, I'm sorry. Truly. Marshall paused at the door. I know, he said without turning around. That's why I answered your question. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Daniels sat in silence, the weight of the exchange settling around him. For the first time since the courtroom, he felt a small measure of the tension in his chest release. Not forgiveness, as Lisa had said, that would be premature, but perhaps the first tentative step toward understanding. Later, as he was preparing to leave, Lisa handed him a worn folder. Homework, she said. If you're serious about learning, read these. They're first-hand accounts from veterans about their transition back to civilian life. The unfiltered truth. Daniels accepted the folder, recognizing the trust this represented. Thank you. I'll bring it back tomorrow. See that you do, she replied. And Daniels? James has PTSD group therapy here tomorrow at 10. You should make yourself scarce during that time. He's working hard on his recovery, and seeing you might set him back. Daniels nodded, grateful for her forthrightness. I understand. I'll work in the back room. As he drove home, the folder on the passenger seat beside him, Daniels realized that his education was just beginning. The gap between what he had assumed about veterans and the reality of their struggles was vast, and bridging it would require more than a few days of volunteer work. It would demand a fundamental shift in how he saw his role as a police officer and as a citizen. For the first time since his suspension, he felt a sense of purpose, not just to make amends to one man, but to understand a system that had failed so many, and perhaps, in some small way, to begin changing it. Daniels stayed up until 3 in the morning reading the accounts Lisa had given him. The stories varied widely. Some veterans had returned home to supportive families and communities, others to emptiness and isolation. Some had found purpose in new careers, while others struggled to translate their military skills to civilian jobs. Yet common threads emerged. The culture shock of returning to a society that seemed trivial after the intensity of war, the frustration of trying to explain experiences to people who could never truly understand, the invisible wounds that persisted long after physical injuries had healed. One account in particular haunted him, an Army sergeant describing how he'd alienated his family because he couldn't stop checking windows and doors at night, couldn't sit in restaurants with his back to the entrance, couldn't explain why fireworks sent him diving for cover. "I came home," he wrote, "but I never really came back." The next morning, Daniels arrived at the VRC early, dark circles under his eyes but with a new sense of urgency to his volunteering. True to his word, he stayed in the back room organizing supply closets when Marshall's therapy group began. He could hear the muffled sounds of voices through the wall, but couldn't make out words. Just the rise and fall of conversation, occasionally punctuated by a laugh or extended silence. Around 11, Lisa appeared at the closet door. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. "The building across the street is being demolished today. Nobody informed us. The first blast is scheduled in 15 minutes. Daniels immediately understood the problem. "The therapy group?" "Exactly. Some of them won't react well to unexpected explosions. We need to get them out of here before it starts." "What do you need me to do?" Daniels asked, already setting aside the supplies he'd been inventorying. "Help evacuate the building. Most staff and visitors can use the front entrance, but we need to take the therapy group out the back way to the parking lot. They can't see the demolition site from there." Daniels followed Lisa down the hallway, passing the meeting room where Rodriguez was already speaking calmly but urgently to the group. Through the open door, Daniels could see 8 veterans of varying ages, including Marshall, who sat rigidly in his chair, eyes fixed on Rodriguez. "We've called for transportation to take you to the secondary location," Rodriguez was saying. "While we wait, we'll move to the back parking lot. It's safer there." The veterans began gathering their things, some moving quickly, while others seemed confused by the sudden change. Marshall stood but remained in place, his expression distant, as if he were already retreating inward. Lisa directed staff members to lead regular visitors out the front entrance, while Rodriguez guided the therapy group toward the rear exit. Daniels held doors and helped an elderly veteran with a walker, careful to maintain a respectful distance from Marshall. They had almost reached the back door when the first warning siren sounded from across the street, 3 long blasts signaling imminent demolition. The effect on the group was immediate. One man dropped to a crouch, covering his head. Another began breathing rapidly, eyes darting around the hallway. Marshall froze entirely, his body rigid, eyes unfocused. "James," Rodriguez said firmly, placing himself directly in Marshall's line of sight. "You're at the Veterans Resource Center in Westfield. It's 2023. You're safe." But Marshall didn't seem to hear him. His breathing had become shallow, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Daniels recognized the signs of a flashback from the accounts he'd read. Marshall wasn't in the hallway anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere dangerous. "We need to get him outside before the blast," Lisa said urgently to Rodriguez. "If he's triggered while enclosed..." A second warning siren cut through the air, louder than the first. Marshall flinched violently, his back hitting the wall. His eyes, wide and unfocused, scanned the hallway as if searching for threats. "Contact left," he suddenly shouted, his voice transformed into a commanding bark. "Jones, cover that doorway. Sanders, with me." Rodriguez tried again to reach him, but Marshall was deep in the grip of his flashback, issuing orders to squad mates who weren't there. When Rodriguez touched his arm, Marshall reacted defensively, his training taking over as he moved to neutralize what his mind perceived as a threat. Daniels stepped forward without thinking. "Sergeant Marshall," he called out, using the military title deliberately. "Stand down, area secured. Repeat, area secured." Marshall's focus shifted to Daniels, confusion crossing his face. Daniels continued, keeping his voice firm but calm, using the military terminology he'd learned from the veterans' accounts. "Mission complete, Sergeant. Your team is safe. We're evacuating to secure transport now. That's an order." Something in Marshall's eyes shifted, not full recognition, but a response to the structure and clarity of the commands. His posture remained tense, but he nodded sharply. "Copy that," he replied. "Evacuation route?" Daniels gestured to the back door. "This way, Sergeant. Double time." Marshall moved toward the door with military precision. Rodriguez and Lisa exchanged glances but followed his lead, guiding the rest of the group outside just as the final warning siren began. They had barely reached the parking lot when the first controlled blast shook the ground, a deep rumble followed by the crash of falling concrete. Several veterans reacted to the sound, but being outside in the open air seemed to help. Marshall, however, had dropped into a crouch beside a parked car, his breathing ragged, still caught between past and present. Rodriguez knelt beside him, speaking quietly, while Lisa organized the other veterans into the arriving vans. Daniels stood back, uncertain of his place in this situation but unwilling to simply walk away. After several minutes, Marshall's breathing steadied. He blinked rapidly, looking around the parking lot with growing awareness, the fog of the flashback gradually lifting. When his gaze found Daniels, there was recognition there, along with something else. Uncertainty, perhaps embarrassment. Rodriguez helped Marshall to his feet. "You're okay, James. Let's get you to the secondary location." As they walked toward the last van, Marshall paused beside Daniels. "You knew what to say," he said quietly. "How?" Daniels hesitated. "I've been reading, trying to understand." Marshall studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Thanks," he said simply before continuing to the van. Later, after the group had departed and the staff were returning to the building, Lisa approached Daniels. "That was quick thinking," she said. "Where did you learn to talk someone down from a combat flashback?" "From the accounts you gave me," Daniels admitted. "One veteran wrote about how his wife would use direct, mission-focused language to help ground him during episodes. I just tried what seemed right." Lisa's expression softened slightly. "Well, it worked. That could have gone much worse." She paused, seeming to consider something. "Captain Rodriguez is bringing the group back here after lunch. He wants to talk to you." The prospect of meeting with Rodriguez, the man who had exposed his ignorance in court, who had every reason to despise him, sent a wave of anxiety through Daniels. "About what happened today?" "Partly," Lisa replied. "But I think it's more than that. He's been watching your work here more closely than you realize." The demolition continued throughout the day, but with proper warning, the staff were able to prepare. Daniels worked through lunch, helping to rearrange the meeting spaces to accommodate groups displaced by the noise. Around 2 o'clock, Rodriguez returned with the therapy group, now much calmer after spending time at a quiet secondary location. As the veterans dispersed, Rodriguez approached Daniels. "Got a minute?" They walked to Rodriguez's small office, where the captain closed the door and gestured for Daniels to sit. The walls were covered with military photos and commendations, along with flyers for various veterans programs. "What you did today," Rodriguez began, "potentially prevented a serious escalation. James's flashbacks can be intense. The last one put him in the hospital." "I'm glad I could help," Daniels said carefully. Rodriguez studied him with the assessing gaze of someone used to making quick judgments about character. "Why are you really here, Daniels? The truth." It was the third time Daniels had been asked this question, but somehow the answer had evolved with each asking. At first it was guilt, he admitted. Then it became about education, learning what I didn't know. But now, he paused, searching for the right words. "Now I think it's about responsibility. Not just for my actions toward Marshall, but for what happens next." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That's a start," he said. "But understanding is just the beginning. The question is, what will you do with it?" It was a question Daniels had been asking himself with increasing frequency. What would he do when his suspension ended? How would this experience change his approach to policing? There were no easy answers, but for the first time he felt the stirring of possibility, that perhaps his mistake could lead to something meaningful, not just for himself, but for the veterans he had failed to see. 2 weeks into his suspension, Daniels had established a routine at the Veterans Resource Center. He arrived early each morning, helped with whatever tasks needed doing, and spent his lunch breaks reading everything he could find about veterans' issues. The staff had gradually warmed to his presence, moving from suspicion to cautious acceptance. Even Lisa had begun greeting him with a nod instead of a frown. Today, however, broke the pattern. When Daniels arrived, Rodriguez was waiting for him by the front desk. "Morning, Daniels. Got an assignment for you if you're interested." "Of course," Daniels replied, curious about the captain's unusually direct approach. "The VA finally came through with housing for James. He's moving into an apartment today. Could use some help." Daniels hesitated. "Are you sure he'd want my help specifically?" Rodriguez's expression remained neutral. "I asked him. He said yes." The simple statement surprised Daniels. After the flashback incident, he'd seen Marshall around the center occasionally, but had maintained a respectful distance, not wanting to impose his presence. That Marshall would accept his help felt significant. "What time?" Daniels asked. "Now. He's waiting outside." Outside, Marshall stood beside a worn pickup truck that had seen better days. He wore jeans and a faded army t-shirt, looking more relaxed than Daniels had ever seen him. "Marshall," Daniels greeted him, uncertain of the protocol for this new territory. "James," Marshall corrected him. "If you're going to help me move furniture, we might as well use first names. I'm assuming you have one besides officer?" "Michael," Daniels said, feeling oddly vulnerable providing this small personal detail. "Michael," James repeated with a nod. "Let's go. Rodriguez is letting us use his truck, but we only have it until 3. The drive to the storage facility was mostly silent, but not uncomfortably so. James seemed focused on the road, occasionally tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in rhythm to some internal music. Daniels used the time to observe the man without the filter of his previous assumptions. Up close, the scars on James's face and hands told stories of violence survived, while the steady precision of his movements spoke of military discipline never forgotten. At the storage unit, James unlocked a small space containing a modest collection of furniture: a bed frame, a dresser, a small table with 2 chairs, and several boxes. "Not much," James commented, seeing Daniels' assessment. "I sold most of what I had before I ended up on the street. This is what Rodriguez salvaged from my last apartment and what people have donated. They worked efficiently, loading the larger items first, then the boxes. James was stronger than his lean frame suggested, easily managing his end of the heavy dresser. As they worked, the silence gradually gave way to practical conversation, and then, surprisingly, to something more. "How long were you in?" Daniels asked as they secured the furniture with straps. 12 years, James replied. "Enlisted at 18, straight out of foster care. The Army was the first real family I had." Daniels absorbed this new piece of information. That must have made it harder to leave. James glanced at him, perhaps assessing whether the comment was genuine interest or platitude. "It was like losing my family all over again," he finally said. "Not just the people, but the purpose, the structure, knowing exactly where I fit." They closed the truck bed and climbed into the cab. As James started the engine, he continued, "The military breaks you down to build you up their way. Makes you an incredible soldier, but doesn't exactly prepare you for civilian life. Everything that makes you effective in combat can make you dysfunctional back home." The apartment was in a modest complex on the east side of town, part of a veterans' housing program that had finally found space for James after months on the waiting list. It was small but clean, with a bedroom, living area, kitchenette, and bathroom. Most importantly, it was ground floor with 2 exits. Details Daniels now understood were critical for someone with combat-related PTSD. They unloaded the furniture, assembling the bed frame and positioning the table near the kitchen. As Daniels helped unpack dishes donated by the VRC, he noticed James carefully placing a small wooden box on top of the dresser. "Military mementos?" Daniels asked. James paused, then opened the box. Inside were not medals or insignia, but photographs. James with fellow soldiers, all young and smiling in desert camouflage. James kneeling beside a German shepherd wearing a military vest. A group shot of what appeared to be his unit before deployment. "My team," James said simply. "And Rex, my service dog after I got back." Daniels remembered what Lisa had told him about the dog's death triggering James's spiral into homelessness. "He looks like he was a good partner." "The best," James replied, his voice softening. "Better than most people. He understood without me having to explain." James closed the box carefully and returned it to the dresser top. They continued working, breaking only for a quick lunch of sandwiches Rodriguez had packed for them. As they ate, sitting on folding chairs since the table was still covered with boxes, Daniels found himself sharing stories from his own life. Growing up in a blue-collar neighborhood, his decision to become a police officer after his sister was mugged in college, his struggles with the reality of policing versus his idealistic expectations. "I wanted to help people," Daniels admitted. "Sounds naive now, but that's why I joined. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing certain people as problems instead of people with problems." James considered this. Military's not so different. We start with good intentions, then the system and experience change how we see things. Survival sometimes means dehumanizing the other. He took a sip of water. "The trick is finding your way back." The simple wisdom of the statement struck Daniels deeply. "Is that what you're doing? Finding your way back?" James looked around the small apartment, at the sparse furnishings and donated dishes. "Trying to," he said. "Some days are better than others." They finished unpacking around 2 o'clock. The apartment still needed much: curtains, a couch, kitchen supplies, but it was habitable, a stable foundation from which James could rebuild. "Thanks for the help," James said as they prepared to leave. "Not just today. What you did during the flashback too." Daniels shook his head. "No need to thank me." "Actually, there is," James insisted. "Not everyone would have known what to do. Not everyone would have cared enough to learn." The acknowledgement was unexpected, a small bridge across the gulf that had separated them. Daniels accepted it with a nod, knowing better than to diminish its significance with false modesty. As they drove back to the VRC, James asked, "What happens when your suspension ends?" "Back to patrol," Daniels replied, "though Captain Rivera wants me working with the VRC as part of community outreach." James nodded thoughtfully. "You'll see things differently now." "That's good, but it won't be easy. The other officers won't have your perspective." The observation cut to the heart of something Daniels had been increasingly concerned about: how to translate what he was learning into his work as a police officer, especially among colleagues who hadn't shared this experience. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "About proposing some kind of training program for the department, focusing on veterans' issues, recognizing signs of PTSD, that sort of thing." James was quiet for a long moment. "If you're serious about that," he finally said, "I might be willing to help. Not right away. I need to get myself stable first. But eventually." The offer stunned Daniels. After everything that had happened, that James would consider working with him, potentially sharing his painful experiences to educate others, demonstrated a generosity of spirit Daniels wasn't sure he deserved. "I'd be honored," he said simply, "when you're ready." Back at the VRC, Rodriguez was waiting for them. He raised an eyebrow in question, and James nodded, a silent confirmation that things had gone well. As James went inside to complete paperwork for his new housing, Rodriguez turned to Daniels. "He's a good man," Rodriguez said. "One of the best I've ever served with. What happened to him could happen to any veteran without proper support." "I'm beginning to understand that," Daniels replied. Rodriguez studied him for a moment. "You know, when James first told me about the arrest, I was ready to destroy your career. I had the contacts to do it too." "What stopped you?" Daniels asked, genuinely curious. "James did. He said there were enough broken people already. He didn't need to break another one." Rodriguez shook his head slightly. "That's who you laughed at in that courtroom, Daniels. Remember that." As Rodriguez walked away, Daniels remained by the truck, the weight of those words settling around him. In the midst of his own suffering, James had chosen compassion over vengeance, understanding over anger. It was a standard of humanity that humbled Daniels, making his own journey toward redemption seem both more urgent and more possible. With renewed purpose, he headed back into the VRC, ready to continue the work of understanding, not just for James Marshall, but for all the veterans he had failed to see. 3 weeks into his suspension, Daniels found himself at O'Malley's, a bar frequented by officers after their shifts. He hadn't planned to come, but Reynolds had texted him repeatedly, insisting they talk outside the precinct. Sitting in a corner booth nursing a club soda, Daniels felt strangely out of place in an environment that had once been comfortably familiar. Reynolds arrived 20 minutes late, already carrying the slight swagger that indicated he'd had a drink or two elsewhere before arriving. He slid into the booth across from Daniels with a forced smile. "Man, you look different," Reynolds said, studying him. "Lost weight?" "Been busy," Daniels replied, not elaborating. "What's up? Your text sounded urgent." Reynolds glanced around before leaning forward. "Look, I wanted to give you a heads up. There's talk at the precinct, people taking sides about your suspension." "Sides?" Daniels asked, though he wasn't really surprised. "Yeah. Johnson and Mercer are saying the department threw you under the bus to appease the veterans groups. They're pretty vocal about it, especially after a few beers." Reynolds took a swig from the beer a waitress had just delivered. "But Rivera's got his supporters too. He's using your case in briefings, talking about community relations and vulnerable populations." Daniels absorbed this information, realizing that his personal journey had become a political football within the department. "And where do you stand?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. I'm just trying to do my job, man. But I gotta ask, what's with you spending all this time at that veterans place? Word is you're there every day, working for free. I'm learning, Daniels said simply. Learning what? How to be a social worker? Reynolds's tone carried a hint of derision. You're a cop, Michael. A good one. You made one mistake with this Marshall guy, but everyone's acting like you committed some terrible crime. It wasn't just a mistake, Daniels replied, feeling a surprising surge of protectiveness toward James. And his name is James. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. You're on a first-name basis with the homeless vet now? The one whose lawsuit could still get you fired? There is no lawsuit. He never filed one. Yet, Reynolds countered. Look, all I'm saying is watch your back. This whole thing could still blow up. These guys with PTSD, they're unpredictable. Today he's your new best friend. Tomorrow he could snap and come after you. The casual prejudice in Reynolds' statement, the same prejudice Daniels himself might have expressed a month ago, landed like a slap. That's not how PTSD works, he said quietly but firmly. And James is one of the most stable, grounded people I've met, despite everything he's been through. Reynolds stared at him, confusion giving way to something like disappointment. Jesus, they've really gotten to you, haven't they? What, you feeling guilty? Trying to save one homeless vet to make up for all the ones we've rousted from park benches? Daniels set his glass down carefully, aware that his response could permanently alter his relationship with his partner. I'm trying to become a better officer by understanding the people we serve, all of them, including veterans like James who end up on the streets through no fault of their own. Noble, Reynolds said, not bothering to hide his sarcasm. Just remember where your loyalties should lie when you come back. We're the ones who'll have your back out there, not some homeless vet with mental problems. My loyalty is to doing the job right, Daniels replied. And part of that is understanding that people like James aren't the enemy. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Reynolds growing increasingly dismissive and Daniels more defensive. They parted on strained terms, leaving Daniels to walk home through the cool evening air, mulling over the exchange. Reynolds's attitude had disturbed him, not because it was unexpected, but because it so closely mirrored what his own perspective had been just weeks ago. The realization left him wondering how many other blind spots he still carried, how many other prejudices remained unexamined in his approach to policing. The next morning, Daniels arrived at the VRC to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the lobby, Captain Rivera. The precinct commander looked out of place in the modest surroundings, his crisp uniform drawing curious glances from veterans waiting for services. Captain, Daniels greeted him, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. What brings you here? Checking on my investment, Rivera replied cryptically. Got time for a chat? They found an empty meeting room where Rivera got straight to the point. I've been getting regular reports about your work here. Lisa Chen speaks highly of you. Daniels hadn't realized Lisa had been communicating with his captain. I'm just trying to learn, sir. And what have you learned, Daniels? Rivera's gaze was piercing, assessing. Daniels considered the question carefully. That I've been looking without seeing, that there's a whole population of veterans in crisis that our department isn't equipped to properly serve, that my own approach has been part of the problem. Rivera nodded slowly. Good start. Now the harder question. What do you propose to do about it? The directness of the question caught Daniels off guard. Sir? You've identified a problem in how our officers interact with veterans in crisis. I'm asking what solution you recommend. Daniels realized this wasn't a casual check-in. It was an opportunity. Training, he said decisively. Not just the standard sensitivity seminar, but real education about veterans issues, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, the challenges of reintegration. and not from outside consultants, but from veterans themselves. Like Marshall? Rivera asked. Eventually, maybe, if he's willing. But there are others too. Rodriguez, the veterans in the support groups here. People with first-hand experience who can help officers understand what they're really seeing when they encounter a veteran in crisis. Rivera studied him thoughtfully. Draft a proposal. I want it on my desk the day your suspension ends. Be specific. Curriculum, instructors, time requirements, expected outcomes. Yes, sir, Daniels replied, trying not to show his surprise at the captain's receptiveness. One more thing, Rivera added as he stood to leave. I heard about your conversation with Reynolds last night. Daniels tensed. Sir, Rivera held up a hand. The department's changing, Daniels. Not everyone's going to come along willingly. You need to decide if you're prepared for the resistance you'll face, not just from colleagues, but from a system that's slow to adapt. After Rivera left, Daniels sat in the meeting room, processing the conversation. The captain's support was unexpected but welcome. The warning about resistance, however, gave him pause. His experience with Reynolds had been just a taste of what might come if he pursued this path. His contemplation was interrupted by Lisa poking her head in. When you're done soul-searching, James is here for his appointment with the employment counselor, but she's running late. He could use some company. Daniels found James in the waiting area, reviewing a stack of papers with intense concentration. He looked up as Daniels approached, offering a slight nod in greeting. Job applications? Daniels asked, gesturing to the papers. Resume drafts, James corrected, trying to translate highly skilled at neutralizing enemy combatants into civilian-friendly language. Daniels smiled at the dark humor. How's the apartment working out? Good. Quiet. First time I've slept more than 3 hours straight in months. James set the papers aside. Rodriguez says your captain was here. News travels fast. Small building, lots of nosy veterans. James studied him for a moment. He's evaluating whether you've learned your lesson. Something like that, Daniels admitted. He wants me to draft a proposal for a training program about veterans' issues for the police department. James raised an eyebrow. You were serious about that? Yes, but I'll need help. People who can speak from experience. James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I might know some people who'd be willing. Not just from here. I've been reconnecting with guys from my old unit, those who made it back anyway. The fact that James was reconnecting with former comrades struck Daniels as a significant step in his recovery. That sounds promising. There's a catch, James continued. Some of them have had negative experiences with law enforcement, arrests, harassment, worse. They won't be telling feel-good stories. That's exactly what officers need to hear, Daniels said firmly. The unvarnished truth. James studied him, perhaps assessing his sincerity. Come by the apartment tonight, 1900 hours. Some of the guys are getting together. You can meet them, see if they'd be a good fit for what you're planning. The invitation was unexpected, a significant extension of trust. You sure they'll be okay with me being there? No, James said frankly. But I'll vouch for you. Whether that's enough will depend on them. He paused, then added, wear civilian clothes. No one needs to know you're a cop right away. The employment counselor arrived then, ending their conversation. As James followed her to her office, Daniels remained in the waiting area, contemplating the evening ahead. He was being offered a rare opportunity to see the world through the eyes of combat veterans, to hear their unfiltered experiences with police and other authorities, to understand the challenges they faced from their own perspective. It was also, he recognized, a test. James was opening a door into his personal life, introducing Daniels to people he considered brothers. How they received him, and how he responded to them, would determine whether his talk of change was genuine or merely a salve for his own conscience. As he returned to his volunteer duties, Daniels felt the weight of the opportunity before him. Tonight could be the difference between a superficial training program that checked administrative boxes and something truly transformative, both for the department and for himself. Daniels stood outside James's apartment building at 6:55 p.m., second-guessing his decision to come. He'd followed instructions, wearing jeans and a simple blue Henley instead of anything that might identify him as law enforcement. Still, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he wasn't accustomed to. He was about to enter a gathering of combat veterans who likely shared James's initial distrust of police without the shield of his badge or the authority it conveyed. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the stairs to apartment 103 and knocked. James opened the door, greeting him with a nod. The apartment had transformed since they'd moved the furniture in. A second-hand couch now sat against one wall, a small TV on a stand opposite it. The kitchen table was covered with snacks and drinks, and something that smelled like chili simmered on the stove. "You came," James said, stepping aside to let him in. "Wasn't sure you would." "Almost didn't," Daniels admitted. Three men were already there, their conversation pausing as Daniels entered. The silence was palpable, an almost physical weight of assessment. "Guys, this is Michael," James said simply. "Michael, meet Carlos, Derek, and Ty." Carlos was a stocky Hispanic man with a sleeve of tattoos and watchful eyes. Derek, tall and lanky with a closely cropped beard, sat in a wheelchair positioned near the couch. Ty, a black man with the powerful build of someone who spent serious time at the gym, stood by the window, his stance subtly defensive. "Michael's the one I told you about," James added, and understanding dawned in their expressions. "The cop," Ty said, his tone neutral, but his gaze intensifying. Daniels fought the urge to deny or defend. "Yes," he said simply. Carlos gestured to one of the folding chairs. "Sit, man. James says you're okay, and that's enough for now." The initial tension didn't dissipate entirely, but it eased enough for conversation to resume. Daniels listened more than he spoke, absorbing the casual banter between men who had shared experiences he could barely imagine. They talked about mutual acquaintances, upcoming VA appointments, and a veterans softball league Carlos was trying to organize. When two more veterans arrived, a woman named Maya who had served as a combat medic and an older man introduced only as Sarge, the gathering took on the comfortable rhythm of a family dinner. James served the chili, which turned out to be his grandmother's recipe, while stories and jokes flowed freely around the table. Daniels remained mostly quiet, aware of his outsider status, but grateful for the window into this tightly knit community. Occasionally, someone would explain an inside joke or military reference for his benefit, a small but meaningful inclusion. After dinner, they moved to the living area where the conversation gradually shifted to more serious topics. Derek, who had lost both legs to an IED, described his ongoing battle with the VA to get his disability benefits adjusted. "They keep losing my paperwork," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "3 times I've submitted the same forms. Meanwhile, I can't afford the modifications my apartment needs." Maya nodded in understanding. "Took me 14 months to get my PTSD officially recognized. 14 months of nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks, all while they kept telling me I needed more documentation." "Documentation of what?" Daniels asked, breaking his silence. "Your service record should be clear." "Should be," Sarge agreed, his weathered face creasing in a bitter smile. "But the system's designed to wear you down, make you give up. They count on it." Ty, who had been watching Daniels carefully throughout the evening, leaned forward. "Can I ask you something, officer?" "Michael," Daniels corrected gently. "And yes. Before all this happened with James, how many homeless vets you think you arrested? Ballpark figure." The directness of the question caught Daniels off guard, but he sensed its importance. Dozens, probably. I never really kept track. And how many times did you ask why they were on the street? How many times did you help them get services instead of slapping cuffs on them? The answer stuck in Daniels's throat, a hard truth he couldn't avoid. Not often enough. Ty nodded, not in judgment but in confirmation of what he'd already suspected. I spent 11 months living in my car after my last tour. Clean record, honorable discharge, combat decorations, didn't matter. The nightmares kept me from holding down a job, couldn't afford rent, ended up in that car. Know how many cops knocked on my window in those months? How many? Daniels asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be pretty. 23, Ty said precisely. 23 times I was told to move along, threatened with arrest, treated like garbage. Not one of those 23 officers asked if I needed help or pointed me toward resources. Not one. The room fell silent, the weight of Ty's experience hanging in the air. Daniels felt the familiar tightness of shame in his chest, but also something else, a growing resolve. That's why I'm here, he said finally. Not just because of what happened with James, but because I need to understand stories like yours if anything's going to change. Carlos, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. What exactly are you trying to change, man? The whole system's broken. One cop having an epiphany isn't going to fix that. Maybe not, Daniels acknowledged. But my captain's given me the opportunity to develop a training program for our department, focusing on veterans issues. I want it to be real, not just sensitivity training, but actual education about what veterans face, what officers should look for, how to connect people with resources instead of just making arrests. Sarge raised an eyebrow. And you think your fellow officers will listen? Some will, Daniels said honestly. Some won't. But even reaching a few could make a difference. Maya considered this. What kind of training are we talking about? PowerPoints and role-playing scenarios? I was thinking more like direct testimony, Daniels replied. Veterans sharing their experiences firsthand, explaining what they need from law enforcement, what helps versus what makes things worse. And you'd want us to do this? Derek asked, gesturing around the room. Open ourselves up to a room full of cops who might not want to hear it? Daniels recognized the vulnerability such an ask entailed. Only if you're willing, and only if you believe it might help the next veteran an officer encounters. James, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke. I've been thinking about doing it, he said quietly. Telling my story, I mean. If it prevents even one veteran from going through what I did, it would be worth it. His statement carried special weight, given what he had experienced at Daniels's hands. The others looked at him with varying degrees of surprise and respect. If James is in, I'll consider it, Ty said after a moment. But I'm not sugarcoating anything. They get the raw truth or nothing. That's exactly what they need, Daniels assured him. The conversation continued, evolving into a brainstorming session about what effective police training might include. Each veteran offered perspectives from their own experiences. Maya emphasized the importance of recognizing medical crises versus psychiatric ones. Derek spoke about accessibility issues that officers often overlooked, and Sarge stressed the need for patience when dealing with veterans in crisis. By the time the gathering began to wind down around 11, something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The initial wariness had given way to cautious engagement, skepticism tempered by the possibility, however slight, of meaningful change. As the others began to leave, each said goodbye to Daniels with varying degrees of warmth, from Carlos's non-committal nod to Maya's surprisingly firm handshake and direct, "Good luck with this." When only James and Daniels remained, they sat in momentary silence, the evening's conversations settling around them. "Thank you," Daniels said finally. "For including me. For vouching for me with your friends." James shrugged slightly. "They needed to see you as a person, not just a uniform. Same way you needed to see me as more than just another homeless vet." The symmetry of that statement struck Daniels forcefully, the recognition that they had both been guilty of reducing each other to stereotypes, and both were now working to see beyond them. "Do you think any of them will actually help with the training?" he asked. "Some might," James replied. "Trust has to be earned, though. They've all been let down by the system too many times to jump in based on promises alone." Daniels nodded, understanding the caution. Whatever happens with the training tonight was educational. "That was the point," James said with the ghost of a smile. "Consider it your first lesson." As Daniels prepared to leave, a thought occurred to him. "You know, I keep thinking about what you said in court that day, that you were just trying to stay out of the rain. Such a simple human need, and I criminalized it." James considered this. Most human needs are simple: safety, shelter, respect. It's the systems we build around them that get complicated. The observation stayed with Daniels long after he left, echoing in his mind as he walked home through quiet streets. The evening had given him not just stories and perspectives, but something more valuable, a fundamental shift in how he viewed his role as a police officer, not as the enforcer of laws, but as a protector of human dignity in all its forms. Daniels's first day back on duty arrived with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He'd spent the final week of his suspension drafting the training proposal for Captain Rivera, incorporating insights from James and the other veterans he'd met. The document represented not just a professional obligation, but a personal commitment to changing how the department interacted with the veteran community. The locker room fell quiet when he entered, conversations pausing as officers glanced his way. Some nodded in greeting, others looked away, and a few, like Johnson and Mercer, made a show of continuing their conversation about political correctness ruining real police work. Daniels changed into his uniform with methodical precision, ignoring the tension around him. At morning briefing, Captain Rivera acknowledged his return with professional neutrality. Officer Daniels will be resuming his regular patrol duties, with additional assignment to community outreach at the Veterans Resource Center twice weekly. The announcement drew some muttered comments that Rivera silenced with a sharp look. As assignments were distributed, Daniels was surprised to find himself paired with Officer Tamara Chen, a 5-year veteran known for her by-the-book approach and impeccable record. "Guess we're partners today," Chen said as they headed for their patrol car. Her tone was neutral, giving away nothing about her feelings on the assignment. "Looks like it," Daniels replied, matching her professional demeanor. They settled into an easy routine as the shift began, responding to calls and patrolling their assigned sector with efficient coordination. Chen was a good officer, observant, thorough, and respectful in her interactions with the public. Still, Daniels sensed she was watching him, evaluating his performance with careful attention. Around midday, they received a call about a disturbance at Jefferson Park, where a man was reportedly harassing passers-by. As they arrived, Daniels spotted a middle-aged white man pacing near the central fountain, gesturing aggressively and shouting at no one in particular. "I'll take lead," Chen said, but Daniels had already noticed something in the man's bearing, the way he scanned his surroundings with hyper-vigilant attention. "Wait," he said. "Let me try something first." Chen raised an eyebrow but stood back as Daniels approached the man, maintaining a respectful distance. "Sir," Daniels called clearly, keeping his hands visible. "I'm Officer Daniels. I'm not here to cause you any trouble. Can we talk for a minute?" The man spun toward him, eyes wild with fear or anger. "They sent you to silence me. I know what you're doing." Rather than advancing or issuing commands, Daniels stopped and lowered his voice. "No one sent me to silence you, sir. I'm just checking to see if you need any assistance. Are you a veteran by any chance? The question seemed to catch the man off guard. His posture shifted slightly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. Marine Corps. 2 tours in Iraq. What's it to you? Daniels nodded respectfully. Thank you for your service. Some people in the park were concerned about you. Can you tell me what's going on today? The man, who introduced himself as Frank Miller, gradually calmed as Daniels engaged him in conversation. It emerged that he'd missed his medication for several days because his VA prescription had run out, triggering episodes of paranoia and agitation. Rather than arresting him for disturbing the peace, Daniels contacted the Veterans Crisis Line and waited with Miller until a VA representative arrived to assist him. Back in the patrol car, Chen studied Daniels with newfound curiosity. That was good work back there. Most officers would have gone straight to arrest. That's what I would have done a month ago, Daniels admitted. Your suspension really changed you, huh? It changed how I see the job, Daniels replied carefully, and who I'm actually serving. Chen was quiet for a moment, then asked, This veterans training you're developing, is it actually going to make a difference, or is it just for show? The directness of her question suggested genuine interest rather than skepticism. It will if enough officers take it seriously, Daniels said, if they're willing to see past their assumptions, like I had to. I'd like to see the proposal when it's ready, Chen said, surprising him. My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came back different. Maybe if his arresting officer had handled things more like you did today, he wouldn't be serving 5 years for assault. The revelation shifted something between them, not quite friendship, but a mutual understanding based on shared concern. For the remainder of their shift, Chen asked thoughtful questions about what Daniels had learned during his suspension, and he found himself sharing more than he'd intended about James, the veterans he'd met, and his evolving perspective on policing. At the end of the day, Daniels stopped by Captain Rivera's office to deliver his proposal. The captain accepted the thick folder with an appraising look. Thorough, he commented, noting the tabbed sections and supplementary materials. It needs to be, Daniels replied. This isn't something that can be covered in a 2-hour sensitivity training. Rivera nodded, setting the proposal on his desk. How was your first day back? Educational, Daniels said, thinking of his interaction with Miller in the park and the unexpected connection with Chen. The department feels different somehow. The department hasn't changed, Daniels. You have. Rivera leaned back in his chair. That makes things more complicated, not less. You're seeing problems you didn't notice before, approaches that need improvement, colleagues who might not share your new perspective. Is that a bad thing? It's a challenging thing, Rivera corrected. Change comes with resistance, especially in institutions like this one. The question is whether you're prepared for that resistance and committed to pushing through it. The words echoed what Rivera had said during his visit to the VRC, a warning that now carried more concrete meaning after Daniels' experiences in the locker room and briefing that morning. I am, Daniels said with quiet conviction. Rivera studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll review your proposal and have an answer for you by the end of the week. In the meantime, I expect exemplary performance on patrol. No mistakes, no controversy. We need to rebuild trust in you as an officer before we position you as an agent of change. Understood, sir. As Daniels left the precinct, he felt the weight of the day settling around him, the mix of familiar routines and new perspectives, the subtle shifts in how he was perceived by his colleagues, the tentative steps toward redemption. It wasn't going to be easy, navigating this transformed landscape while staying true to his evolving understanding of what good policing should be. His phone buzzed with a text from James. How was the first day back? The simple inquiry suggested a level of concern that Daniels found unexpectedly touching. He typed back, "Challenging but good. Made a difference for a vet in crisis today." James's reply came quickly. "That's one. Keep going." 1. The word stuck with Daniels as he drove home. One veteran helped instead of arrested. One officer, Chen, potentially open to a different approach. One small victory in what would likely be a long campaign for change. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. At home, Daniels changed out of his uniform and sat at his kitchen table with the copy he'd kept of his training proposal. He'd titled it, "Seeing the Invisible Wounds, a Comprehensive Approach to Policing in Veteran Communities." The curriculum he'd outlined included sessions on recognizing signs of PTSD and TBI, de-escalation techniques specific to combat veterans, information about available resources, and most importantly, direct testimony from veterans about their experiences with law enforcement. Flipping through the pages, Daniels paused at the section where he'd listed potential veteran speakers. James's name was there, along with TBD notes for the others he'd met. Whether any of them would actually agree to participate remained uncertain, a testament to the fragile trust he was working to build. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Lisa from the VRC. "James mentioned you helped a vet today instead of arresting him. Good start. See you tomorrow for your community outreach shift?" "I'll be there," Daniels confirmed. As he prepared for bed, Daniels reflected on the strange new territory he was navigating. Not quite belonging in either world yet, caught between his identity as a police officer and his growing connection to the veteran community. He wasn't naive enough to think one successful intervention or one training proposal would transform the system, but for the first time, he could envision a path forward. Gradual, difficult, but possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to either reinforce or undermine the changes he was trying to make. The weight of that responsibility was substantial, but no longer overwhelming. He had purpose now, clarity that had been missing before. One day, one interaction, one mind at a time. That was how change happened, not in sweeping revolutions, but in the quiet persistence of doing better today than yesterday. With that thought, Daniels drifted off to sleep, his uniform hanging ready for tomorrow's shift, his resolve strengthening for the work ahead. 3 weeks after Daniels returned to duty, Captain Rivera called him into his office. The training proposal had been sitting on the captain's desk, presumably under review, while Daniels divided his time between regular patrol shifts and his outreach work at the VRC. During those weeks, he'd managed to maintain a delicate balance, performing his police duties with renewed awareness while gradually rebuilding his reputation among his colleagues. "Close the door," Rivera instructed when Daniels entered. The captain's expression gave nothing away as he gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "I've reviewed your proposal, twice. Had the deputy chief and the training coordinator review it as well." Daniels waited, his stomach tightening with anticipation. "It's ambitious," Rivera finally said. "Comprehensive, potentially expensive, and absolutely necessary." He slid a document across the desk, Daniels's proposal with "Approved" stamped across the cover page. "Congratulations. You've got 4 weeks to put together the first training session." Relief and anxiety washed over Daniels simultaneously. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "This wasn't an easy sell," Rivera continued, his expression serious. "The deputy chief was concerned about resources, the training coordinator about schedule disruption, and some of the senior officers." He paused. "Let's just say there's resistance to what they see as social work masquerading as policing." "I expected that," Daniels admitted. "Expect more of it," Rivera warned. "You're challenging deeply ingrained attitudes and approaches. That makes people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable people get defensive, and defensive people can become obstacles. So what changed their minds? Rivera's expression softened slightly. Data. I pulled arrest records for the past 3 years, focusing on veteran-related incidents. The numbers tell a story of escalation rather than resolution. Repeat arrests, increasing severity of charges, cyclical patterns that suggest our current approach isn't working. Even the budget hawks couldn't argue with the cost analysis of repeatedly arresting, processing, and incarcerating the same individuals versus connecting them with appropriate services. Daniels nodded, understanding the power of translating human suffering into the cold logic of statistics when trying to change institutional thinking. There's one condition, Rivera added. The first session will be a pilot, attended by select officers who volunteer. If, and only if, the feedback is positive, we'll expand to department-wide implementation. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. I understand, sir. When can I announce the volunteer opportunity? Already done, Rivera said. Email went out this morning. We've got 12 officers signed up so far. 12 out of 227, Rivera finished for him. Like I said, there's resistance, but 12 is enough for a pilot. Make it count. Leaving the precinct that afternoon, Daniels felt the weight of the opportunity he'd been given. 12 officers might seem like a small number, but if those 12 left the training with new understanding and approaches, the impact could ripple outward through their daily interactions, their partnerships, their influence on department culture. He drove straight to the VRC to share the news with Lisa, and hopefully with James. Lisa's reaction was immediate and practical. We'll need to coordinate schedules for the veterans who'll be speaking, she said, already reaching for her calendar, and prepare them for what to expect. Some of them have never shared their stories in a formal setting before. Do we have any commitments yet? Daniels asked. James is definitely in. Maya from the dinner party, too. She's bringing another female veteran who had a particularly bad experience with police during a mental health crisis. Ty is still considering it. Derek says he's willing if we can arrange transportation. The progress exceeded Daniel's expectations. That's incredible. Thank you for helping coordinate this. Lisa waved away his gratitude. This isn't just for you, you know. Every veteran who has a better interaction with police because of this training, that's what we're working for. James wasn't at the center that day, but Daniels found him later at a coffee shop near his apartment, reviewing paperwork with intense concentration. He looked up as Daniels approached, a smile of recognition softening his usually guarded expression. Heard the news, James said as Daniels sat down across from him. Rivera approved the training. Word travels fast. Lisa called. She's excited. Says it's the first time she's seen the department take veterans' issues seriously. Daniels gestured to the paperwork spread across the table. What's all this? Job applications, James replied. Got an interview next week at a security consulting firm. They specialize in high-risk assessment, hire a lot of former military. That's fantastic, Daniels said, genuinely pleased. In the weeks since James had moved into his apartment, he'd made steady progress, attending therapy regularly, reconnecting with former comrades, and now seeking employment that would utilize his specialized skills. It's a start, James said with characteristic caution, assuming they can look past the gap in my employment history and the fact that my address until recently was Park Bench. They'd be lucky to have you, Daniels insisted. James gathered his papers, changing the subject. So, 12 volunteers for your training. Not exactly overwhelming support. It's enough for now. Quality over quantity for the pilot. And if it goes well? Then we scale up. Department-wide implementation, potentially expanding to other precincts if the results are positive. James nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about my part in this, what I want to say. Whatever you're comfortable sharing, Daniels assured him. That's just it, James replied, his expression serious. I need to be uncomfortable. Sanitizing my experience wouldn't serve anyone. These officers need to hear the ugly truth, what it feels like to be treated like garbage by the people who are supposed to protect and serve, what it does to someone who's already fighting internal battles to be humiliated and criminalized for simply trying to survive. The directness of his statement hit Daniels with full force. Including my role in that? Especially your role, James confirmed. The fact that you're leading this training after what happened between us, that's powerful. It shows change is possible, that mistakes can become catalysts instead of just regrets. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from dispatch, a situation developing downtown that required additional officers. Daniels apologized for the abrupt departure, but James waved him off with understanding. Go, do good work. We'll finish planning later. The situation downtown turned out to be a protest outside the courthouse, veterans demonstrating against cuts to local support services. By the time Daniels arrived, a tense standoff had developed between protesters and officers attempting to keep the courthouse entrance clear. He recognized several faces from the VRC among the demonstrators, including Ty and Sarge. Officer Mercer was directing officers to form a perimeter, his hand resting conspicuously on his baton as he barked orders at the protesters to disperse. The veterans, many in partial uniform displaying their service insignia, held their ground with disciplined determination. Daniels approached Mercer, keeping his voice low. What's the situation? These troublemakers are blocking a public entrance, Mercer replied, loud enough for nearby protesters to hear. They've been ordered to disperse and are refusing to comply. They're exercising their right to peaceful protest, Daniels countered, noting the completely non-violent nature of the demonstration. And they're veterans, many of whom have sacrificed for the very rights they're exercising now. Mercer's expression hardened. Don't start with that bleeding heart crap, Daniels. They're breaking the law, period. Before Daniels could respond, Ty spotted him and approached the police line. Several officers tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but Daniels stepped forward to meet him. Officer Daniels, Ty acknowledged formally. We're within our legal rights here. Peaceful demonstration, maintaining clearance for emergency access, not blocking the entire entrance. I know, Daniels replied, but there's concern about public access to the courthouse. That's the point, Ty said. We want people going into that courthouse to see us, to understand that the budget decisions being made in there have real consequences for veterans in this community. Mercer stepped forward aggressively. Back behind the line now. The sudden escalation sent a ripple of tension through both the police line and the protesters. Daniels saw hands tightening on batons, veterans shifting into defensive stances, a volatile situation teetering on the edge of confrontation. In that critical moment, Daniels made a choice. He stepped between Mercer and Ty, facing his fellow officer. Let me handle this, he said quietly but firmly. There's a better way. Mercer glared at him. Your suspension's over, Daniels. Time to remember which side you're on. I know exactly which side I'm on, Daniels replied. The side of de-escalation and community safety. For everyone. He turned back to Ty, conscious of both his colleagues and the protesters watching this exchange. What if we work out a compromise? A designated demonstration area that keeps the main walkway clear, but still ensures visibility for your message? Ty considered this, then nodded slowly. If you can guarantee we won't be dispersed or arrested for the duration of the scheduled protest, I think we can work with that. Over the next 20 minutes, Daniels negotiated a solution that satisfied both the protesters' right to be seen and heard and the department's responsibility to maintain public access. As the tension gradually dissipated, he noticed Captain Rivera observing from a distance, his expression unreadable. Later, as the protest continued peacefully within the agreed-upon boundaries, Rivera approached him. Interesting approach, Daniels. It seemed like the right call, sir. It was, Rivera confirmed. But not everyone agrees. Mercer's already filed a complaint about you undermining his authority. Daniels absorbed this news with resignation, but not surprise. I stand by my decision. As do I, Rivera said. Which is why I'm adding Mercer to the list of officers attending your training. Mandatory, not voluntary. As Rivera walked away, Daniels realized that his training program had just gained a new dimension. Not just education for the willing, but intervention for the resistant. The challenge had grown considerably, but so had the potential impact. With renewed determination, he returned to monitoring the protest, watching as veterans exercised the rights they had fought to defend, knowing that his own fight, for understanding, for change, for a better approach to serving his community, was only just beginning. The community room at the precinct had never felt so small to Daniels as it did on the morning of the training. He arrived 2 hours early to arrange chairs in a circle rather than the typical classroom style, set up the modest refreshments Lisa had suggested would make veterans feel more welcome, and review his notes one final time. Each detail mattered. This wasn't just a training session, but the culmination of a personal and professional journey that had begun with a moment of casual cruelty in a courtroom. Captain Rivera arrived early as well, surveying the setup with an appraising eye. Nervous? Terrified, Daniels admitted, but ready. The deputy chief is attending, Rivera said, watching Daniels' reaction carefully. No pressure. Daniels managed a tight smile. None at all. The veterans arrived next, filing in as a group. James, Maya, Derek in his wheelchair, Ty, who had finally agreed to participate, Sarge, and a woman Daniels hadn't met before who Maya introduced as Rachel, a former Army intelligence officer. They positioned themselves around the circle, their posture and expressions reflecting varying degrees of tension and resolve. Thank you all for being here, Daniels said quietly. I know what this took. James nodded slightly, his eyes scanning the room with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to identify exits and potential threats by instinct. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and khaki pants. Interview clothes, Daniels realized, remembering his job prospect. Good luck today, James said, with the training and everything else. Before Daniels could ask what he meant, the officers began arriving. Chen came first, offering a supportive nod as she selected a seat. Others followed. Some Daniels knew well, others he recognized only in passing. Mercer entered last, his reluctance evident in every line of his body as he took a chair as far from Daniels as possible. At precisely 9 o'clock, Daniels stepped into the center of the circle, acutely aware of the diverse expectations facing him, from the veterans hoping for genuine understanding, to skeptical officers fulfilling a requirement, to superior officers evaluating the program's viability. Good morning, he began. Thank you all for being here today. This training isn't about policies or procedures. It's about people, specifically the veterans in our community, and how we as law enforcement can better serve them, especially those in crisis. He gestured to the veterans seated around the circle. These individuals have agreed to share their experiences with us, both their service to our country and their interactions with police after returning home. Some of these stories will be difficult to hear. Some may challenge your perceptions or make you uncomfortable. I ask only that you listen with an open mind. Daniels then stepped back, yielding the floor to Maya, who spoke with clinical precision about her experiences as a combat medic and the PTSD that followed her home. She described panic attacks triggered by sirens, the hypervigilance that made crowded spaces unbearable, and a particular encounter with police during a dissociative episode that had left her handcuffed in a hospital hallway for hours. Derek followed, explaining how his physical disability often overshadowed his invisible wounds, leading officers to misinterpret his trauma responses as intoxication or non-compliance. Ty spoke about his months living in his car, Rachel about the sexual assault she'd experienced during her service, and how a male officer's aggressive approach during a routine traffic stop had triggered a devastating flashback. Throughout these accounts, Daniels watched the officers' reactions, Chen's growing understanding, several officers taking notes with increasing engagement, and Mercer's crossed arms and skeptical expression gradually giving way to reluctant attention. Then it was James's turn. He stood slowly, his hands steady though Daniels could see the tension in his shoulders. "My name is James Marshall," he began. "Former Special Forces, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart." He paused, his gaze sweeping the circle. "None of that mattered when I was sleeping in a bank doorway trying to stay out of the rain, and Officer Daniels found me there." The room fell completely silent. This was the moment Daniels had both anticipated and dreaded, the public reckoning with his own failure. "I had been on the streets for 18 months by then," James continued. "Lost my housing, my job, my support system after my service dog died, and I couldn't afford to keep my apartment. The VA had a 2-year waiting list for housing assistance. The shelters were full that night. The temperature was dropping, and it was pouring rain." He described the arrest in unflinching detail, Daniels's dismissive attitude, the rough handling despite James's visible wince from shrapnel wounds that never fully healed, the laughter shared with his partner at James's expense. "But that's not actually why I'm here today," James said, his voice steady. "I'm here because of what happened after. Because Officer Daniels could have just served his suspension and gone back to business as usual. Instead, he chose to learn, to understand, to change his approach not just toward me, but toward all veterans in crisis." James turned to face Daniels directly. "That choice matters more than the mistake, and it's a choice every officer in this room can make, regardless of past actions or assumptions." As James returned to his seat, Daniels stepped forward again, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you all for your honesty and courage," he said to the veterans. Then, addressing his fellow officers, "This isn't about assigning blame or inducing guilt. It's about recognizing opportunities to serve better, to see the human being behind the crisis, to connect people with resources instead of simply processing them through the system." For the next hour, they discussed practical applications, how to recognize signs of PTSD versus intoxication, de-escalation techniques specific to combat veterans, local resources officers could connect veterans with instead of making arrests for minor infractions. The conversation grew increasingly engaged, with even Mercer eventually asking a question about approaching veterans experiencing flashbacks. As the session concluded, Captain Rivera addressed the group. "This is just the beginning. Based on today's pilot, we'll be developing a comprehensive department-wide program. Officer Daniels will continue to lead this initiative, with these veterans as regular contributors, assuming they're willing." The implication was clear. The pilot had been deemed a success. As officers began to file out, many stopped to thank the veterans personally. Daniels noticed Mercer hesitating by the door, then turning back to approach James. "Your service record," Mercer said awkwardly. "That's impressive. I had an uncle in Afghanistan. Never talked about it much." James nodded. "Most of us don't. Hard to explain to people who weren't there." "Yeah," he said the same thing. Mercer seemed to struggle with his next words. "Anyway, thanks for this. It was educational." It wasn't an apology or a profound transformation, but it was acknowledgement, a small crack in a hardened perspective. As Mercer left, James turned to Daniels with the hint of a smile. "That's one." "One," Daniels agreed, remembering their earlier exchange. "Keep going." After the room had cleared except for the veterans and Rivera, the captain approached James. "Mr. Marshall, did Officer Daniels mention the department's community liaison position?" James looked surprised. No, he didn't. It's a new role, Rivera explained. Part-time to start, working with our officers on veteran-specific cases, helping develop protocols, facilitating connections with resources. Given your background and first-hand experience, you'd be an ideal candidate, if you're interested, of course. The offer caught Daniels completely off guard. This hadn't been part of any discussion he'd had with Rivera. Looking at James, he saw the same momentary shock, followed by careful consideration. "I have a job interview this afternoon," James said. "Security consulting firm." Rivera nodded. "This wouldn't interfere. The hours are flexible, designed to accommodate other employment or VA appointments." "Can I think about it?" James asked. "Of course. The position won't be officially posted until next week." Rivera shook James's hand, then addressed the group. "Thank you all again. What you've done here today will have an impact far beyond this room." As the veterans prepared to leave, James lingered behind. "Did you know about this?" he asked Daniels. "Not a clue," Daniels replied honestly. "But it makes perfect sense. The department needs someone like you, someone who understands both worlds." James considered this. Kind of a full circle, isn't it? From being arrested by this department to potentially working for it. "Life rarely moves in straight lines," Daniels observed. "You heading to your interview now?" James checked his watch and nodded. "Wish me luck?" "You don't need it," Daniels said with conviction. "But good luck anyway." As they walked out of the precinct together, Daniels felt the weight of the past months, the shame, the learning, the gradual rebuilding of his professional identity, settle into something approaching peace. There was still so much work to do, so many officers to reach, so many systems to change. But today had proven that change was possible. One mind, one interaction, one story at a time. "Hey," James said as they reached the parking lot. "Remember when you asked if the medals would have made a difference that night at the bank?" "I remember," Daniels replied. "The medals weren't what made the difference in the end," James said thoughtfully. "It was this, the willingness to see beyond them, to see the person. That's what changed everything." As James drove away toward his interview, Daniels stood for a moment in the bright morning sunlight, reflecting on how far they had both come from that rainy night and that tense courtroom. Not to an ending, but to a new beginning, a chance to transform a moment of injustice into a legacy of understanding. With renewed purpose, he turned back toward the precinct, ready for whatever came next in this journey they had somehow ended up sharing. A police officer and a homeless veteran, unlikely allies in the slow, essential work of change,